The creature from the raft, at first glance, looks like nothing more than an oil slick floating on a lake. A kind of black, silent, and apparently harmless mass. The problem is that this thing can move of its own accord, pursue its victims, squeeze through small spaces, and dissolve a living person in a matter of minutes. And as if that were not enough, its surface produces strange colors that seem to hypnotize anyone who stares at them for too long. This creature appears in The Raft, one of Stephen King's simplest and, at the same time, most disturbing stories, which years later was adapted as one of the segments in Creepshow 2. And what is curious is that, despite everything we get to see of this monster, King never explains what it really is, where it comes from, or how long it has been living inside that lake. So today we are going to go over its story, its abilities, its behavior, and the different theories that could explain its true nature. Because the more we analyze this thing, the harder it becomes to fit it into any known form of life. The story begins in late October and follows 4 college students named Randy, Deke, Rachel, and Laverne, who decide to drive to an isolated lake for one last swim before winter finally arrives. Summer ended weeks ago and the water is freezing, but in the middle of the lake there is still an old wooden raft that normally should have been removed when the season ended. In fact, Randy describes this platform as a small piece of summer that someone forgot to put away until the following year. And although at first this seems like nothing more than a nostalgic observation from the character, this idea ends up becoming quite important, since the 4 young people are basically trying to recover for a few hours something that has already ended. Either way, Deke and Randy enter the water first and begin swimming toward the raft, while Rachel and Laverne follow shortly afterward. That is when Randy notices something strange in the distance, a black patch floating on the surface. At first he thinks it might be spilled oil. Randy even remembers previously helping clean up a similar spill, so he more or less knows what one should look like. But this thing seems different. It is too dark, too compact, and above all, it seems to be changing direction regardless of the wind. And Randy begins to notice that the mass is moving directly toward Rachel and Laverne as the girls swim toward the platform. So he starts shouting at them to hurry, and eventually all 4 manage to climb onto the raft before the creature reaches them. When Randy tries to explain what he has just seen, the others do not really believe him. To them, it is probably still some kind of contamination floating on the lake. But Randy cannot get one thought out of his head. The spill he had seen before was an accident. This thing, on the other hand, seemed to move with a purpose. Shortly afterward, the mass reaches the platform and Rachel begins staring at its surface. Different colors then appear within that darkness, like a kind of iridescent glow moving and forming patterns. Rachel becomes completely fascinated. She leans over the raft and extends one of her fingers. Randy tries to warn her, but it is already too late. As soon as Rachel touches the creature, the black substance immediately sticks to her skin and begins moving up her hand and arm, dissolving the tissue it comes into contact with. Rachel screams and tries to free herself, but she ends up falling into the lake. Her friends try to help her, although there is really nothing they can do, and the creature begins wrapping itself around her until she finally disappears beneath the water. That is when the other 3 realize that this is not simply contamination, it is alive, and it is hungry. After Rachel's death, Randy, Deke, and Laverne try to decide what to do. The shore is too far away to risk swimming without knowing how fast the creature can move, and to make matters worse, the trip was completely spontaneous. Practically no one knows where they are, so they decide to wait. Maybe the thing will simply leave after feeding. However, the slick knows how to wait too. For a while it remains around the platform, moving slowly until it eventually disappears beneath it. Deke then sees an opportunity. Being the strongest and most athletic member of the group, he thinks he could jump into the water and reach the shore before the monster has time to react. But before he can do it, something happens that completely changes the situation. A small portion of the creature appears between the wooden boards and reaches his foot. The slick immediately begins dissolving it while pulling him downward. Randy and Laverne try to hold on to him, but the monster's strength is enormous. And in the story, this scene is considerably worse than in the movie, because Stephen King describes how the creature tries to pull Deke's entire body through an opening much narrower than he is. Since he obviously cannot fit, It simply keeps pulling. The pressure eventually destroys his leg and brutally deforms his body until Randy can no longer hold on to him. Eventually, Deke disappears beneath the platform, and this is when Randy and Laverne realize that not even the raft is truly safe. As long as they remain completely on top of the boards, the creature cannot reach them, but any part of the body positioned over an opening can immediately become an opportunity. So they begin constantly watching the creature's movements while trying to rest in turns. But the hours pass. The temperature continues to fall, and neither of them manages to truly sleep. In fact, the creature seems to realize that it does not need to hurry, since every time they try to sit down or relax, it starts moving beneath them again. So little by little, the cold, fear, and exhaustion begin doing the work for it. Randy and Laverne eventually embrace to preserve their body heat, and, in the story, that closeness eventually develops into a desperate sexual relationship. And for a few moments, both of them seem to be trying to recover precisely what they originally came to the lake looking for. That feeling of summer, youth, and freedom that was already disappearing. But while they are distracted, one of Laverne's long strands of hair ends up falling through an opening. The slick finds it. First, it attaches itself to the hair, and then begins climbing until it reaches her head. Randy tries to hold her, but quickly realizes that he cannot compete with the monster's strength, and eventually Laverne is consumed as well. So Randy is left completely alone. By this point, he has been awake for practically the entire night. He is freezing, exhausted, and even begins hallucinating about the possibility of someone coming to rescue him. But no one appears. And the worst part is that every time he tries to sit down, the creature starts approaching beneath the platform again. So when darkness returns, Randy finally begins to give up. Then he looks at its colors again. And this detail is probably one of the strangest aspects of the entire creature. Because throughout the story, those iridescent patterns have been shown to produce a very peculiar fascination. Rachel became mesmerized while staring at them before touching the mass. And Randy has also had to force himself to look away. But now he no longer wants to. He is too tired. So he watches those colors swirling within the darkness and begins wondering whether they might distract him from the pain when the time comes for him to be consumed. Eventually, he stops resisting and even begins speaking to the creature. He asks it, "Do you love me?" And with that, the story practically ends. King never directly shows us Randy's death, although everything indicates that he ultimately gives himself over to the slick. Now, the adaptation in Creepshow 2 preserves almost the entire basic structure of the story, although it changes some important details and completely alters the ending. Here, once again, we see the 4 young people trapped on the platform, and we also see the creature consume a duck first, making it quite clear from the beginning that it is some kind of predator. Rachel once again becomes the first victim, and Deke dies after the slick emerges between the boards and drags him beneath the raft. However, the situation with Laverne changes. In the movie, while she is asleep, Randy begins touching her and ends up positioning her over one of the openings in the platform. This allows the creature to reach her face from below and begin consuming her. And while Laverne is being dragged toward the water, Randy sees his opportunity. This time he jumps. He swims toward the shore with all his strength while the slick remains occupied feeding, and surprisingly, he manages to make it. Randy gets out of the lake and begins celebrating, shouting at the monster that he has finally beaten it. But he makes a mistake. He stays practically right next to the water. So the creature reaches the shore, raises part of its body like an enormous black wave, and launches itself directly at him. Randy disappears beneath the mass, and the slick calmly returns toward the center of the lake. Then the camera moves through the vegetation and reveals a sign that had remained hidden the entire time, which reads, "No swimming," which leaves open a rather disturbing possibility. Someone probably knew that there was a danger in that lake long before the young people ever arrived there. And well, now that we know the entire story, we can better analyze what kind of creature this black slick might actually be. First of all, it is fairly obvious that we are dealing with a completely amorphous organism. We do not see eyes, we do not see a mouth, and there are no recognizable limbs, bones, or organs. Its body appears to be formed from a single flexible mass capable of expanding, contracting, and pushing small portions of itself through extremely narrow spaces. In addition, after consuming its victims, Randy notices that the creature seems to have increased in size. This implies that it does not simply kill its prey, but probably incorporates the tissues it consumes into its own mass. Basically, the more it eats, the larger it becomes. Its method of feeding is also quite interesting, since when it comes into contact with living tissue, it first attaches itself and then begins destroying it almost immediately. It could release digestive enzymes, produce some kind of corrosive substance, or perhaps its own surface possesses completely unknown chemical properties. But everything points toward a form of external digestion. In other words, the creature breaks down its prey before absorbing the resulting material. And this would also explain why it does not need a conventional mouth, since its entire surface could essentially function as a digestive system. Now, what really makes the slick interesting is its behavior, because after everything we have just seen, it is quite clear that it does not behave like a mass that simply waits for something to touch it. It behaves like a true predator. It follows its prey, takes advantage of opportunities, and seems to learn which parts of the raft it can use to reach them. And this raises a very interesting question. Does the creature actually think? It is possible, although it does not necessarily need to possess intelligence comparable to that of a human. It could simply have an extremely developed predatory behavior. For example, one possibility is that it detects movement or vibrations in the water. Since it has no visible eyes, perhaps it locates its victims through mechanical changes in its environment. The movements produced by someone swimming would be easy to detect, while vibrations transmitted through the raft itself could tell it approximately where its prey is located. This would fit its behavior quite well, although it remains only one possible explanation. And then we have the colors, probably its most mysterious characteristic. As we have already seen, the black surface produces a series of iridescent reflections that move while forming patterns, and the fact that this effect influences different characters makes it difficult to believe that it is simply a coincidence. So it is possible that they function as a kind of lure, and within nature, there are different animals that use light, color, or movement to attract or confuse their prey. So the slick could be using a much more extreme version of that same principle. Even so, there is another possibility. Perhaps the creature does not even produce these colors consciously. Maybe they are simply a natural characteristic of its surface, and the human brain reacts abnormally when trying to process them. And it is precisely that ambiguity that makes this ability even more disturbing. As for its weaknesses, we have very few certainties. We know that the wood of the raft functions as a barrier as long as the victims remain completely on top of the boards, so apparently the creature cannot pass through or dissolve this material as easily as it destroys living tissue. And this is quite important, because throughout the entire time it remains around the raft, we never see it attempt to directly consume the wood. Instead, it has to take advantage of the spaces between the boards to reach its victims. So its ability to dissolve materials appears to be selective. Flesh, skin, hair, and even bones can be destroyed and absorbed, while the wood of the raft resists its contact, at least for the duration of the story. This could indicate that its digestive substances are specialized in breaking down animal organic matter, or simply that certain materials such as wood require much more time to degrade. In any case, the raft functions as an effective protection as long as no part of the body is exposed through the openings. Now, a different question is whether the creature needs to remain in the water in order to survive, and here we also cannot say that it is incapable of leaving the lake, because Creepshow 2 clearly shows that it can project a large portion of its body onto the shore to capture Randy. What we do not know is how far it can move away from the water. Perhaps it needs to keep its body wet. Maybe it depends on an aquatic environment for long periods of time, or perhaps it simply prefers living in the lake because that is where it can move and hunt most effectively. And finally, neither version shows us any specific way of killing it, so we really do not know whether it possesses any physical weakness beyond the limitations we have just seen. So when we try to explain what it really is, several possibilities begin to emerge. The first and probably most obvious is that it could be some kind of gigantic single-celled organism, something similar to an amoeba. And the comparison makes some sense, because amoebas do not have a rigid body shape either, and can deform themselves to surround and consume food. So visually it fits quite well, although there is an obvious problem. Because a creature that is several meters across and capable of exerting enough force to destroy Deke's body would require a biology completely different from that of any known single-celled organism. And we would still have to explain its speed, the colors, and its apparently intelligent behavior. Another possibility is that the slick is not even a single organism. It could be a gigantic colony of microorganisms functioning as a single entity, something similar to a biofilm. Because real biofilms are basically communities of microorganisms that live within a matrix they produce themselves and can adhere strongly to different surfaces. So taken to an extreme, the slick could be a gigantic colony functioning as a single organism. Millions or even billions of cells could produce digestive substances, absorb the resulting nutrients, and move together as a single mass. This would also explain why we do not see recognizable organs, because the entire colony would be the body. What does not quite fit is its behavior, because in order to actively pursue human beings, take advantage of different opportunities, and possibly use its colors as a lure, we would have to assume that this colony developed some kind of extremely advanced coordination or even a form of emergent intelligence. And this is where purely biological explanations begin to fall short. That is why some fans have compared the slick to creatures from cosmic horror, especially the Shoggoths of H.P. Lovecraft. Here, the resemblance is fairly obvious, since both are amorphous beings that are difficult to classify and possess completely strange biology. However, there is no evidence that the slick is literally a Shoggoth, but this comparison does lead us toward a much more interesting possibility. Perhaps we are trying to apply the biology of our world to a creature that does not even come from it, and this is where Stephen King's own shared universe comes into play. Because within the Dark Tower saga, there are places known as thinnies, where the barrier separating different realities becomes extremely thin. These areas can function as points of contact between different worlds, and within King's cosmology, there are also the so-called Todash spaces, associated with entities and creatures that exist outside our conventional reality. So it could be possible that at some point, one of these weak points formed within or near the lake, and the slick simply crossed over into our world. I personally think this is one of the most interesting theories, because it would explain why its biology is so difficult to classify. Perhaps we are not looking at a gigantic amoeba, an evolved bacterium, or any terrestrial organism at all, but rather a creature that evolved under completely different conditions on another level of reality. Because all of its characteristics, in the complete absence of any explanation regarding its origin, fit this possibility quite well. In addition, Stephen King uses the idea of creatures originating from other worlds or dimensions in several of his stories, so conceptually it would not be too far removed from the author's broader cosmology. Even so, it is important to make it clear that the story never directly connects the slick to a thinny. It is only a theory. But among all the possibilities, it is probably one of the ones that fits best within Stephen King's wider universe. Finally, there is another rather curious theory that some fans and other content creators have connected to a creature from South American folklore known as El Cuero, found especially in stories from Chile in some regions of Argentina. This entity is usually described as a kind of living hide that inhabits lakes and rivers, where it can wrap itself around a person and drag them beneath the water. And obviously there are certain similarities. We have a flat, aquatic creature with no conventional anatomy that wraps around its victims before pulling them under. That is why some people have suggested that this legend may have inspired Stephen King. However, King himself has not confirmed any connection between the two creatures, so it is better to treat it simply as a rather interesting coincidence. So, well, after analyzing all these possibilities, I think part of what makes the Raft's Black Slick so effective is precisely the fact that no theory manages to explain it completely. A gigantic amoeba could explain its shape. The biofilm theory helps considerably when it comes to understanding its adhesion and its method of absorbing nutrients, while an alien or Lovecraftian nature fits better with the feeling that we are looking at something that simply should not exist. But if we take Stephen King's wider universe into account, I personally think the possibility that it is a creature originating from another level of reality and that it reached our world through a thinny is probably the most interesting. Even so, it remains only a theory, because perhaps that is precisely why Stephen King never explains what the slick really is. The moment we could give it a name, classify it, and understand exactly how it works, it would stop being something unknown and simply become another monster. But as long as it remains nothing more than a black slick moving across a lake, we do not know whether we are looking at an animal, a colony of microorganisms, a creature from another dimension, or something we do not even have the necessary tools to understand. The only thing we do know is that it is an extraordinarily efficient predator. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.